Rack and pinion on a '07 Honda CR-V. First, put the seat belt through the steering wheel, wrap it around if you can. Might need to slide the seat forward while you do this, get it buckled. And then once it's buckled, slide the seat backwards. You don't have to get crazy with it, but just put some tension on the seat belt just to hold the steering wheel in place. And then you're going to disconnect the steering coupler. It's a 10mm bolt down there. And this is why you need to lock the steering wheel, because you can't let that rotate. You'll ruin the clock spring for the airbag. So once that's done, disconnect the negative on the battery. Then you're going to start taking apart the front end, disconnect the tie rods, loosen the jam nuts first, take the castle nut off. If the castle nut gets locked onto the stud and you're just spinning the ball inside the tie rod, take a pry bar, stick it under the frame somewhere, pry down on it, or sometimes you can just pull down on it, and then it'll zip off usually. But anyway, disconnect the tie rods. You're going to disconnect everything underneath. I ended up having to take this big bracket out. There's 14s down there. There's 3 of them. Ratcheting flex head swivel ratchets are helpful for that. A lot of times they're really tight though, so I might need to try to use a breaker bar, put a socket on a long 3/8 ratchet. There's a couple 10mm bolts up here that hold the pressure line onto the rack and pinion. There's also the return line here. It's just a 10mm hose clamp up top. So you just need to loosen that up, pull the low pressure hose off. You're gonna have to reuse the nipple fitting on the rack and pinion. So once you get the old rack out, make sure you take that out, swap it over to the new rack and pinion. The pressure line, a lot of times the fitting will turn and the line will be seized in there, so you'll most likely need to replace the entire power steering pressure line, which is pretty easy, honestly. So there's 2 10mm bolts that hold the return line, or no, there's one for the return line, and then there's 2 for the pressure line, which is up on top. So 2 10s for that. And then you're going to want to, this bracket, I left this big bracket off on the car. I took this one off on the driver's side. Now, be very careful if you're going to loosen up the subframe. So you don't want the engine and transmission crashing down on your head. So you're going to need to at least loosen up the front bolts. They're a 17mm. Loosen them up a little bit, I would say maybe 1 to 2 full turns, both fronts. Then there's one up high. It is right there, right above kind of above the axle, above the sway bar. Now, and then there's 2 down here, of course, on each side. So I backed these out quite a bit to try to lower the subframe. Ran into a problem over here. This bolt was extremely tight and it eventually broke the welded nut off inside the frame. So I could not lower the subframe down as much as I wanted to. When I go to put this back together, we could tack weld. I'll put a little weld here just for reinforcement, but there's 8 bolts that hold the subframe up, so it's not going to be a huge deal. Could go either way on that. Otherwise, you're going to have to cut into the frame, try to either cut it off or something, but that'll end up just being a huge pain. So I would say if you feel like it, you could just weld that. Once you get it all back up and these are together, just put a little bead there. People can always cut through it if they need to drop the subframe again. It's not permanent or anything. So to get the rack and pinion out, I went out through the driver's side. Now, even though I could only drop the subframe a little bit, I was able to use a pry bar right here to just pry it down as much as I could. And then I, of course, make sure the pressure line is unbolted from the rack and pinion and anything else, You're going to have to also unclip the power steering pressure sensor. It's just a squeeze clip, so just squeeze it and pull. Should be able to disconnect it fairly easily. Okay, that's for when you replace the pressure line, because most likely the pressure line fitting is going to be seized on the line. But if not, lucky you. Now, to get the actual rack and pinion assembly out, considering I didn't have a lot of drop in the frame, subframe here, I had to rotate the entire assembly back and forth and work its way out to finally get the main portion with the, I guess I would call it the stub shaft coming out at the top. To get that out, I had to rotate it so that the big bracket on the bottom was right here against the top. So I had to rotate it completely upside down. And then the steering shaft portion would be down here in this corner. So the bottom of the bracket up here, it's like a triangle. And then it'll actually come out. It takes a little bit of maneuvering, but it's not too bad. So I tried to get more room to get it out by taking the sway bar bushing bracket off, but this bolt snapped off. There's a welded nut down inside there that's pretty much inaccessible. Could have let it go, but I ended up taking an air hammer and I went down inside from the back from here and I busted the welded nut off inside there, and then I just dropped a new bolt down through from the top, all tighten that just to make sure the bracket is tight. Other than that, get your return line connected to the nipple, get your pressure line tight. It is like a double flare type line, so there's no O-ring on this one. And then the pressure line itself is really easy to do. It just goes right up top through a plastic bracket and then two 10mm bolts on top of the power steering pump. So when you're all done, just make sure you reconnect the steering coupler. Make sure your wheels are facing more or less straight ahead so that when you reconnect the steering coupler, you don't mess up the clock spring and rip it out. All good.